In the 20th century, more people were killed by their own governments than died fighting in the two world wars. It is common to lay much of the blame for this brutal period at the feet of those who led the most murderous of regimes, such as Hitler in Germany, Stalin in Russia, or Mao in China. While such individuals are obviously deserving of much blame, it would be false to presume that responsibility lies solely with them. Rather, in examining how a tyrannical government can maintain its grip on a nation, it is crucial to recognize the role played by the masses of ordinary men and women. As Hannah Arendt explained, in view of the unparalleled misery which totalitarian regimes have meant to their people, horror to many and unhappiness to all, it is painful to realize that they are always preceded by mass movements, and that they command and rest upon mass support up to the end. This support of the masses takes a variety of forms. For example, individuals are needed to fill such roles as jailers, prosecutors, police, or tax collectors, to name but a few of the many functionaries required for a tyrannical regime to operate. But responsibility extends beyond those employed to carry out the government's deeds. Rather, the majority of citizens, no matter what their occupation, must consent to their own subjugation. As Etienne de la Boétie recognized long ago, the masses always outnumber those who rule, and thus are ultimately in control of their fate. "Resolve to serve no more," he wrote, "and you are at once freed. I do not ask that you place hands upon the tyrant to topple him over, but simply that you support him no longer. Then you will behold him, like a great colossus whose pedestal has been pulled away, fall of his own weight and break in pieces." Given this ability of the masses to end their subjugation, the following question arises. What makes so many people prone to support and participate in the actions of tyrannical governments, when so doing leads to such widespread misery, suffering, and death? It would be comforting to believe that this question is mainly of historical significance, and that the masses in Western nations today are not susceptible to whatever drove those in Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia to participate in the horrors of that time. But this seems very unlikely, as people today share far more similarities than differences with their 20th century ancestors. The psychologist Stephen Bartlett has suggested that most people are what can be called sleepers, who under appropriate conditions would support and willingly partake in the actions of a tyrannical government. As he wrote, "The majority of psychologically normal people are sleepers, that is, they are dispositionally inclined, when the situation is right, to aggression and destructiveness. Their patterns of thought and behavior are to be understood dispositionally, that is, in the conditional sense that, if an adequately provoking situation arises, then the behavior that results will tend to be malignant. They have a pathogenic willingness to inflict harm, which remains latent until an appropriate situation arises." While there are obviously many factors which can activate this latent behavior of which Bartlett refers to, we will examine one explanation for this which was put forth by Carl Jung and further developed by his student Erich Neumann. This explanation posits that a psychological process referred to as scapegoating is key to understanding how so many people can support or actively participate in the atrocities committed by governments. To understand how this process occurs, we must begin with a distinction between Jung's concepts of the persona and the shadow. To fit into society, Jung proposed that each person, as they grow from a child to an adult, develops what he called a persona. One's persona can be viewed as the mask which each person wears, so to speak, in their interactions with other members of society. It represents the type of person we wish to be seen as by other members of our community. Erich Neumann also referred to the persona as one's facade personality, given that it does not reflect the true nature or totality of the individual, but merely reflects those elements of oneself that are in line with the accepted values of one's society. As Neumann wrote, "The persona, the mask, what one passes for and what one appears to be, in contrast to one's real individual nature, corresponds to one's adaptation to the requirements of the age, of one's personal environment, and of the community. The persona is the cloak and the shell, the armor and the uniform, behind which and within which the individual conceals himself, from himself often enough, as well as from the world. It is the facade behind which the dark and strange, eccentric, secret and uncanny side of our nature remains invisible. These dark and eccentric elements which hide behind the persona make up what Jung called the shadow. The shadow is part of one's unconscious and is composed of the elements of one's personality that are seen as conflicting with the values of society. As one goes through life, certain thoughts and behaviors receive positive feedback, and these elements contribute to the development of the persona. Other thoughts and behaviors receive negative feedback, and most people learn to remove these elements from conscious awareness in a process called repression, which occurs automatically and beneath conscious awareness. These repressed elements contribute to the development of one's shadow. The shadow elements of one's personality do not cease influencing thoughts and behaviors merely because one has repressed them into the unconscious, as Newman wrote in his book Depth Psychology and a New Ethic. In repression, the excluded contents and components of the personality which run counter to the dominant ethical value lose their connection with the conscious system and become unconscious or forgotten. That is to say, the ego, i.e. one's conscious mind, is entirely unaware of their existence. Repressed contents are withdrawn from the control of consciousness and function independently of it. In fact, they lead an active underground life of their own with disastrous results for both the individual and the collective. Newman stressed that as more and more elements of one's personality are repressed into the unconscious due to increasingly rigid societal expectations, an increasingly radical split occurs between one's conscious mind and the repressed elements which constitute the shadow. Instead of lying passively in the unconscious, these repressed shadow elements operate below the level of conscious awareness, influencing one's life in numerous ways, one of which involves these elements finding expression in the external world through a psychological phenomenon known as projection. The shadow, wrote Newman, which is in conflict with the acknowledged values, cannot be accepted as a negative part of one's own psyche and is therefore projected. That is, it is transferred to the outside world and experienced as an outside object. It is combated, punished, and exterminated as the alien out there, instead of being dealt with as one's own inner problem. Often one's shadow is projected onto a personal relation, be it a spouse, a colleague, or a friend. In such cases, one mistakenly perceives this individual as the source of their problems, not realizing that at root the issues reside within. However, projection of the shadow is not limited to those one has a personal relationship with. Rather, situations can arise where the masses of a society make use of a shared outlet for projection in the form of a scapegoat. Scapegoating is a psychological phenomenon whereby an individual or group of people, due to being perceived as not living in accordance with the collective values and standards of behavior, are falsely accused as being the source of others' misfortunes. As Sylvia Pereira explains in The Scapegoat Complex, members of the community who by a quirk of nature happen to be at variance with the collective norms and values of a society are often